Welcome everyone to this Alliance Breakfast Club. And yes, my first thank you to Paul Hamlin Foundation, who's hosting this with us, and for this lovely venue. It's a beautiful room and breakfast. So thank you to them, and thank you for all of you for coming out this early hour and not particularly lovely weather. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Caroline Hartnell and I'm editor of Alliance. Alliance focuses on philanthropy and social investment, and you should all have worldwide, and you should all have copies. So the topic of the March issue of Alliance, which is the topic of this breakfast club, is why should philanthropy fund the arts? And specifically, that's the specific question we addressed throughout. Why should philanthropists fund the arts? In particular, we looked at whether arts should be funded for their own sake or as part of achieving some other aim. We tried to address questions such as, should philanthropists fund the artists directly? Should they fund greater access? Should they fund only work that promotes social change? So those are the sorts of questions we're going to be looking at this morning. We have a great panel today, and I'd now like to introduce them. So, on my left here, who you've already met, is Régis Cochefort, who is Head of Arts at Paul Hamlin Foundation. And then we'll carry on to the left here. So we have Lucy Neal, OBE, who has, I am going to go through it because it's such an impressive list. I've got quite a long list of things to say here. Theatre maker, community activist, co-founder and director of the London International Festival of Theatre, or LIFT, from 1980 to 2005, and author of Playing for Time, Making Art as If the World Mattered. Do you want to just wave it, Lucy? Because this has just been launched last week. And she's also Happiness Associate at the Happy Museum, which I understand was funded by Paul Hamlin Foundation at its first iteration in 2011. So in a way, Lucy sort of embodies all the things we want to be talking about the crossovers between arts and social justice and the world. Then going to my right, I have John Nixon, who's the former fundraising director at English National Opera, Royal Academy and Tate, and he's also himself a philanthropist, a charity trustee, and author of Giving is Good for You, which I suspect many of you will be familiar with. But I just want to make clear now, this isn't meant to be just about the panellists. We also want the audience to be fully part of the conversation, and that doesn't mean waiting for Q&A, just come in at any time. Just raise a hand and track my attention and join in. So I'd like to start, and then finally, sorry Fiona, because I'm going to ask you, I'm so sorry, this is not meant to be, because this is actually our star panelist here, because she was one of the two guest editors for this special feature, and guest editors are extremely important in pulling the thing together. So Fiona to the right is trust manager of the Millfield House Foundation, among many other things, and most importantly for us now, one of the guest editors for the special feature, who I want to now start by asking her to tell us a bit more about the special feature and how it came to be and what's in it. So Fiona, can I hand over to you?
Okay. This is a really interesting audience because there are some familiar faces and old friends from the arts world. I did have a very long ago career on the fringes of the arts world, and it's really nice to see so many, or read so many names, not so necessarily so many faces, but so many familiar names of the places that you've come from today. My remarks are addressed more to the philanthropists in the audience than the people from arts organisations. But I hope that while I'm talking about arts, you arts people will be nodding, going, yeah, absolutely, yeah, tell them that. That would be a good result for me. As for the philanthropists, it's great that you're here. Are you here because you already believe that arts and social justice just go together like bread and jam? Or are you here because you're a little bit skeptical? I hope there might be one or two skeptics anyway, because a great result for me today would be if the skeptics went away going, do you know there might be something to this? That would be fantastic. But you don't have to declare yourselves at this point. You'll have plenty of opportunity to do that later. The one person who isn't here that I'm really sorry not to have is Hanya Aswad, who was the co-editor with me. Hanya's contribution to this special issue was immense. She is far more internationally networked in the arts and philanthropy than I am. So she was able to bring a very, very rich seam of contacts and understanding from different cultural elements. So I hope you'll find that internationalism is well reflected in the special issue. The origins of this concept come from a thing which I'll have to read out because I won't remember all the words in the right order. The Working Group on Philanthropy for Social Justice and Peace, a really interesting gathering of very, very thoughtful grant makers, international grant makers. From the UK, it includes people like Just Friendly Charitable Trust, for example. A very, very interesting group, which traditionally wasn't that interested in the arts, but was very interested in social justice and peace. But over a period of time, they got to thinking that maybe they should talk about the arts. And being thoughtful people, they gathered several times in different parts of the world and talked about the arts a lot, arts and culture. And they commissioned Mukhtar Kokash, have I pronounced that correctly?
As far as I know.
Okay, we think. Okay, Mukhtar Kokash to write them a report, because these are cerebral people. And he did. He wrote them a very interesting, nearly 50-page report. What he did was he kind of disentangled the arguments and laid out for them all the complications about social justice and arts and culture. He lined up questions like, what's the role of philanthropy in places where the government does fund the arts or doesn't, or won't, or shouldn't, or can't, and so forth. He also talked a little bit about what's the history of culture in active social justice promotion. I won't tell you all of the things in it, but I do recommend that you have a look at it, because it's a very interesting piece of work. However, for me, it appeals to my inner geek. It's very intellectual, it's very analytical, it's very interesting, but it doesn't have that feet on the ground, gutsy, arty stuff. It doesn't have enough artists in it. So when it came to springing off and designing the magazine articles, we decided that we wanted some thinking, for sure. We definitely wanted thinking, but we also wanted doers. Because in my view, and in my experience of philanthropy, we do like to think about the principles, and we do like to lock ourselves in rooms and torture ourselves. We're very good at that. But we also then need to get out, make some grants, do some things, and accomplish something. So we wanted practical examples to be in there. So among the doers, you'll find great articles from Barry Knight and Adrian Ellis, sorry, among the thinkers. And one of the things that I'm really pleased to see is that they look at, you know that old Maslow notion that, you know, the Maslow hierarchy of priorities for human beings. So at the bottom, you've got to have food and shelter and security. And only as you go up the hierarchy and all those other things are satisfied, you get to this pinnacle, which is arts and culture. And the way in which this has consistently been interpreted is that these are the important things, and you can only get here. This is the icing on the cake. That's not how Maslow saw it at all, actually. Maslow saw this as a sort of unitary pyramid of important things for all human beings. But a lot of philanthropists had said, no, we just can't fund the arts because everybody isn't fed and sheltered yet. I am glad to learn from Barry Knight and Adrian Ellis that really people in philanthropy have got beyond that argument. That's kind of old hat. And that was a great discovery for me because I thought they were still having it. And I expect there are some who do. There are other people who argue that if you're using the arts, the waggly fingers here, you are using the arts as an instrument to attain social justice or to get your message across. I've never liked that idea. It seemed to me far too simplistic. I mean, you can take a hammer and send a message to a nail, and it's pretty easy, and it's pretty direct. But hammers don't have ideas. And what we wanted to show here is that if you as philanthropists work with artists, you do not use them as instruments, you work with artists, and you tell them what you would like to get out of things. And what you'll see in all the case studies is that, to your delight, I hope, and surprise, you get something of what you thought you were going to get, but you get much, much more. Because artists aren't just hammers, they are creative, thinking people with their own ideas. And their own ideas are frequently very, very good. And they'll come from left field, and you won't have been expecting it. So, again, you can talk about the instrumentalist part of the arts, but actually it's much richer if you don't bother. Just talk about arts and culture much more generally. Artists are disruptive, and that's what gets you social justice. Disruption, it's a really powerful thing. You'll find as many parts of the world represented as we possibly could. If the special issue had been twice the size or even 3 times, you'd find even more, because as we researched, as we contacted people, we tripped over fabulous examples of people working with artists to promote social justice and even achieve great aims for people in society. Hanya and I are both true believers. You probably gathered that already. We've both had enormous professional and personal experience of transformative arts. Even in my own village in Northumberland, I've seen the way in which people who just kind of walked past each other in the street all of a sudden got incredibly excited and bonded together in that way that communities can when you give them a common purpose that excites them. Anyway, I could go on about that, and I will not. There may still be skeptics. There are plenty of skeptics in the world. So I'm going to just tell you a little thing that I heard on the radio this week, and then we'll get into debate. On the radio, there was a program about the only grand piano in Gaza. It had been found in a terrible state in somebody's warehouse. And a Brussels charity decided to get someone to go across and restore it, so that people in Gaza could hear a grand piano. Now, this was a journalist reporting, so he asked the classic question. With 100,000 or more homes destroyed, thousands without work, most of the water undrinkable, isn't the restoration of a piano a bit of a low priority? He asked that of quite a few people in Gaza, and they nearly all responded in the same way. But there's one quote from one of the people in the program that kind of sums it up. It's the charity director describing what people have said to him in answer to this question. They say, but we want to feel human. We want to feel that we're not only defined as people who need just the basic things, food, protection, a house, security, which are, of course, priorities in life, but it's an act of rebellion. We don't want to accept to be defined in only the survival form of life. So you see, I think we in philanthropy should listen to people on the ground before we make up their minds for them. They want music and theatre and dancing, and they want us to fund them. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. That's a great introduction and quite provocative in some ways.
Hope so.
I'm now going to ask Regis, who is the one on this panel who is actually funding the arts currently. And there's one thing Fiona said, and I wanted just to ask you, really, what, in your view, why should philanthropists fund the arts? Why is Paul Hamlin Foundation funding the arts? And Fiona suggested that even if you come in as an arts funder with what we're going to call instrumentalist ideas, that you've got some other aim as well as funding the arts, should you just forget about it and just fund the artists and forget about that boring aim of yours? Regis, what do you think?
I think it's a brilliant introduction, Fiona, thank you. It's also a very complicated question, but it sits very happily with us, because actually funding artists, including giving money to individual artists, and social justice is what set us up as a foundation. So in one way, that's a complete no-brainer, because there is no tension. This is what we're there to do. And the social justice agenda is what permeates our approach to the arts and to education and learning. I think it's really difficult to sit in this chair as the representative from a philanthropic sector, because actually there is no sector. It's a collection of very, very distinct bodies, some very large, some very small, which range from vehicles for personal philanthropy, which is a perfectly efficient way to give money for things that 1 or 2 or 3 individuals care about, to much larger bodies like ours that are regulated or run by a group of trustees who are appointed on fixed terms because of their skills and their networks and the world that they know. So I'd just like to prick that bubble, which is that there is no philanthropic sector. It simply does not exist. I mean, there are approaches and they're all relevant. And actually what we have in common is that we exist to give money. But apart from that very, very important fact, there is really very little communality of mechanisms even, let alone communality of aim. So that's kind of important as a preamble. I think it's really interesting, and it's great that we're here to talk, and I'd love us to discuss it later on. For us, there is no instrumental versus intrinsic. We give money to artists to do what it is that they want to do, and we give money to arts organization and education organization and universities and local authorities and to do what it is that they do, and hopefully to make them do it better. So there is a purpose, and I suspect the purpose is change. And as far as Paul Hamlin Foundation is concerned, there is absolutely no doubt that the purpose is social change. But it might be quite further down the line. And we give, 3 years, totally free, no strings attached awards to artists, composers and visual artists. And we absolutely don't need to know what it is that they do with it. It might be put a deposit on a studio, it might be childcare, it might be buy a new piano, it might be stop making art and going on trips to refresh your eyes and your palate and get out of a rat race. So I think that that bit for us is really important. But I mean, as I was explaining, at the very, very core of the foundation is the idea of giving people an equality of opportunity. That's what we care, and that's the prism in which we approach the notion of arts, social change. In a way, we support artists and we think about them in the same way that we would think about some particular isolated or disadvantaged communities. It is obvious that our support goes to people who need it. We will not support commercially successful artists who are able to sell their work, make a decent living, and have the impact that they have. We are not giving lifetime achievement awards to celebrate a very successful career. What we want to encourage is practice. We want to support people at moments of fragility, and that applies to organizations as well. At the time when there is the issue of resilience, it's money to continue to work and hopefully to continue to do great things, and it's to succeed. I think it's very interesting, this gathering today, because last week we marked the end of a very, very important initiative for us, which was called Artworks. We had a 10-day celebration. We generated in that 10 days 4 publications, a report, a big evaluation report, a call for action, but we also had 100 conversations with 10 artists across the country, 1,000 people engaging in the very issue of arts in participatory setting. Artworks were an action research project. It was co-funded with Creativity, Culture and Education through Arts Council England and with the Arts and Humanities Research Council. It was thinking about the training of artists who work in participatory settings, from the initial training, wherever they went to university or college, to well into their practice, the continuous professional development of their work. Over 4 years, we investigated new provision in FE, further education or higher education, new courses to start off on the right path, new ways of going to get training when you are already in your career, new ways of thinking about quality as a commissioner, as a local authority, as an arts organization. How do you know who to recruit for delivering what kind of work in what kind of setting? And I think what's really important for us in that action research program is the notion that we created a kind of community of practice that will continue. There is an Artworks Alliance, a group of bodies that have come together and that will continue to work along these issues. And it's all about conversation. This issue of standards is really important. Quality is a really, really very
complex issue, because if you work in prison, how likely are you to be able to talk about your work in the same way that someone working in primary school? And what we discovered is actually you can. And the issue is quality is all about the conversation at the beginning, to try and understand why you're trying to work, to achieve what kind of purpose, and language, trying to have the language done together. I think what's interesting with the idea of artworks and that notion of artists is that it is influencing our strategy. I'll finish very briefly in a moment talking about the world that is emerging. We will launch a new strategy in June. And it is absolutely obvious that the training of artists is something that we will, as of now, fund. Once upon a time, evaluation and research was the sort of new thing. And now it goes without saying that as an organization, to do what you do well, you think about evaluating, not for the funder, but just so that you know whether you're doing good work, and so that you can change the direction of travel by reflecting on your practice. Artists reflect on their practice all the time. It's not by surprise that they destroy their work, or that you don't read what they write, or you don't listen what they've composed. It's reflection. They decided it was not good enough. Whether they're right or not is irrelevant. It's their decision. And that is being reflective. So reflective practice is actually something that is completely artistic. That notion that people just create, or that arts organization, don't think, they just do, is extraordinarily outdated, and I think that's really important. So looking ahead to our new world absolutely have arts and artists embedded at its core. We will focus on ideas and pioneers. I mean, in every area of our work, across social justice, education, the arts, something comes about because someone had an idea and has done something about it. And it's trial and error, and sometimes it starts by being problematic, or it starts by something doesn't work, and then it leads to something else. So we'll try and match this and support individuals in the early development of their ideas. Access and participations are the thing we're about. We were set up because of that, and that's something that we'll continue to do. I think what's interesting is that notion of ambition and change. We're interested in people thinking about how they could do what they do better. It doesn't mean more, it doesn't mean bigger or shinier, it just needs thinking. So it's all thinking about that notion of improvement, but not because what was there before was not good enough, just about a progression route. We're interested about education and learning. It's absolutely at the core of what we do, but we'll focus in the arts and in that interesting relationship between teachers, the confidence of teachers, and how schools as an environment relate to arts organizations. There are great differences between what's happening in Scotland, where creativity went on the curriculum 6 or 7 years ago, and what's happened in England with a whole series of measures that have sidelined the arts within the core teaching under our current government. We're interested in arts evidence. We were one of the first foundations to appoint at the senior management team level someone with a brief to think about impact, and that's something that we care passionately about, but because we see it as a management tool, because it's an advocacy tool, not just because it makes your funders happy. And so arts evidence will be one of the new 6 areas of priorities. We care about youth, and we care about youth organizations, and we will do capacity building for organizations to help them do what they do better. And we care about migration, but not just because of how complex it is to be a young migrant person, but because the host communities are also challenged and need to adapt and change. So it's migration and integration. So for us, having worked for the last 7 or 8 years around 3 major UK programs with an office in India, we're moving away from these 3 programs to think about 6 themes or 6 areas of interest, and trying to build overlap between these, where actually it does not really matter whether you are an arts organization, or you are working in a youth sector, or you're working with ex-offenders or homeless people. What interests us is what it is you're trying to sort out and what impact you're trying to affect. So I'd like to challenge us, you, in our conversation and say that arts for art's sake versus instrumental arts is a nonsense, is kind of irrelevant. We believe passionately in a society where people have the right opportunities, in equality of opportunities, and that applies to artists. And we believe in a society that is enriched by the work that artists do, even if it's to make you scream and say you hate it. That's actually enriching because you can have a proper rant about it. So let's try and move the debate. Let's think about the changes that we as funders and you as deliverers might want to make happen, and let's work together to make these changes happen, regardless of what box or what sort of, what sector it might have fitted on from a public funding point of view. So that would be my utopia for this morning.
Okay. Can I just ask you one follow-up question before I ask Lucy to give the sort of artist perspective? You talked about, on the one hand, you want to fund artists, you're not requiring anything of them, they don't need to buy a piano, they could go on holiday and have look at the world with fresh eyes. You then also talk about how important evaluation is, how important it is to measure impact. So how do those two work together? You're expecting nothing, and how do you measure that impact?
But I think it's about not applying the same rules to everything. So I think it's really trying to think about the right mechanisms in terms of what is the application form, what is the processing for the application, and indeed what is the relationship with the grantee, depending on what it is that we want to do. And we're in an extraordinary position, which is that we will exist in perpetuity. We are spending our income and the pressure is on us to spend more. So we can cook up ideas that need to exist within their own terms. So I think that when we are funding organizations that are thinking about changing something, we insist on them putting together a research framework so that they understand the quality of the work and whether or not it is achieving what they want it to achieve. And actually, if you are trying to change civic society, if you are changing lives, and that's what motivates you, then we argue that in order to continue to do your job, you should jolly well know what kind of changes you are generating through the work that you're doing. So I think the point of being at one end really interesting in the management tools that lie at the heart of research and evaluation, as indeed the potential for advocacy, is absolutely alongside the notion of giving money to people to do what it is that they do with no strings attached. And I think it's having that spectrum of behavior. We run, and we're one of very few foundations in the UK who did a grantee perception report. It's completely classic in the States. Every big grant maker in the States does it with the same organization. So the comparators in the States are very big. In the UK, hardly anybody has ever done it. What's really interesting is that you listen to the feedback of your clients, in inverted commas. It's very commercial. It's about satisfaction of those who you funded and of those you didn't fund it. That's a really interesting message that you listen to. And what comes across is they don't mind investing a lot of time if potentially what's at stake is a very large reward. But it needs to be commensurate with what the reward is. And what's not right is to spend 11 hours in average for an outline application when 90% of the outline applications are rejected. And that's sort of not the right sort of return on investment. So I think it lies in that spectrum. Be fit for purpose and have the kind of expectation to understand what's going on and have that expectation from the people you funded for their own sake when it's relevant.
Okay, thank you. So Lucy, can I turn to you now so to bring in the artist's perspective? So in your view, I mean, can the arts be seen as effective tools to bring about personal and social change? I mean, is this how we should be looking at them? Is this how you'd make the case to a funder? Or would you be appealing more to the intrinsic value of the arts? So I'm bringing in the old dichotomy again. And I think your new book, Playing for Time, Making Art as If the World Mattered, does address these issues a bit. So can I ask you what you feel?
Thank you, Caroline. Yes, is the answer, the first one, about bringing about change. I agree actually with Regis about this false dichotomy. I think it can be very misleading. So I was going to talk really about three things, if I may. The first is the context that I feel we're all, living and working in. The second is about this tome, which I've only held for a few days. We had a launch for it the other night, which is my personal response creatively to the context. And thirdly, a point about resources and sharing our resources, whatever those resources might be at such a time. I feel a little bit, I don't know if any of you saw that film Gravity, but when Sandra Bullock lands, I feel a bit like that at the moment. I've just landed, so I hope to make some coherent sense. So, the context. I don't think any of us can really get away from the fact that we're living at a very historic time, when the personal is planetary at this point. Because whether we're looking at our soil or our oceans or our biosphere in general, we're living at a time of systemic collapse. Our economic model is one that pushes for that collapse, so it's completely at odds with, growth is at odds with life being sustained on the planet. And we can't really get away from that in whichever direction we choose to look, whether we're looking at land or energy or water or fish stocks or how our food will be generated. It's a complex, in one way it's incredibly simple to get our hearts and minds around, but obviously at other levels, when we start to look at carbon in the atmosphere or what is actually happening, to the layers of soil which provide food for us to live and air in the atmosphere. It's complex, and we tend to leave it to the experts or scientists who can absolutely come up with the answers to these things. But, of course, what that systemic collapse also does is to conjure with ideas of home and where we belong, with identity. And these are all questions which somebody described the other day as an art-shaped space. And it's within that context that I deeply started to question a role for myself as a theatre maker. And I enjoy thinking about dramaturgy in our lives in a broader sense from beyond the theatrical stage, in that dramaturgy is a story in a form that can be acted. So the question to myself, becoming increasingly aware of the environmental crisis that we're living through, and trying to join the dots between how those systems were being affected by my own living or by humans on this planet, living collectively, whether they're conscious or not. And my response was this book. It's quite big. Because I decided it mattered. So Playing for Time, Making Art as If the World Mattered, has gathered up in its first part what those drivers of change are. So I've invited some people who can speak very coherently about finance and money, about energy and how we use it and the human relationship to it, about our food growing systems, about values and kindness. Tom Andrews, People United, have contributed a chapter called Radical Kindness, because a lot of all of this comes back to our values. What are our values? Are our values about commodity and consumption, or are our values about community and collaboration? What are our values that actually cherish and support life on this earth? And then the middle section of the book is really about practice. And it's about a practice that I've chose to call transitional arts practice, very much affected by my own local involvement with the transition movement, which is a very bottom-up, very practical, very hands-on response to some of these challenges, but recognizing that we are energy. We are energy ourselves. We have creative energy, and we have an enormous, almost infinite amount of energy when we act in a collective way to respond to some of these challenges. So the practices that are gathered up come from over 60 practitioners. It won't surprise you to find out that many of them are collaborative arts practitioners. They work in the participatory arts. And then the final section of the book is called Recipes for Action, because this is intended as a handbook. It's intended as a way of saying, if the personal is now planetary, how can I act? And it draws out 4 narratives. And those 4 narratives helped me shape the stories that are in this book, which in total are, if you like, a new story to live by. The first narrative is what we call the super narrative. So that is the narrative that is often left out. It's the narrative of home. It's the narrative of our planet that we live on. And we need those life support systems, or, you know, we're not going to be here. The second one is the communal narrative, which is the shared narrative, the narrative that becomes extraordinarily strong when we're able to act together. The third one is a personal narrative, which is that all our lives are lived experientially. You know, how we live is our own story at an emotional level, and also how we act out in the world. And then the fourth narrative is what we call the grand narrative, and that's a narrative of change. And the grand narrative is hugely fed and nourished by the collective one. And we find that where we might have been fearful to act at a personal level, particularly when we're looking at those big macro challenges, but the grand narrative becomes one of drama and possibility for change. So really it's a book about change and exactly how the arts and our own creativity are absolutely key. We can recreate the world, we can reweave the world the way we want it to be, but it will be our imagination, our imaginative capacity to be able to imagine the world we want that allows us to be able to create it. So in that context, this dichotomy between instrumental and arts for art's sake, for me that dichotomy simply evaporates when you begin to look at the context we're in. And art becomes charged, for me, with a completely different purpose. And I mean purpose. Art has a purpose. It has a purpose because it is very happy with responsibility. It's very, very happy with the responsibility. That's why it's tough. That's why it's not easy. That's why it takes risks. That's why it's very brave. That's why it requires courage. Because those responsibilities are moral, they are ethical, they are ecological. And how amazing to live at such a time when, whether we interpret art as a way of daily living, or whether we interpret art as something that we are going to produce and possibly also consume and sell, but somewhere in there, there is a sense of, we've called a transitional arts practice, which is where it is art that is in service to life. And life is represented by building community, by building connection at a time of separation, by fostering our relationships with each other, our relationships to the earth, our relationships to ourselves, our relationships to the natural world. So that's what the book is doing. And it really does all come down to, I think, values, which bring us on to my third point, really, which is about resources. Because for me, so many parameters are shifting at the moment. And when we look at finding resources for our work, actually, I think we'd all agree that to initiate something or to start something, we simply need creative energy. You know, any one of us can initiate anything. The real source of the magic of being able to apply for money and to receive funders from those funders that share our values is that you're then able to consolidate it, develop it, build capacity in it, share it, develop it, sustain it, and take it on. And there is a chapter in this about how to resource your work, and it acknowledges that, you know, transition initiatives all over the world have got going without any money. Artists will go on practicing, you know, their work. But there comes a point when you can't subsidise that any longer yourself, although, you know, artists' own work is a huge element of the subsidised system because they do it. So really the question I now ask is about these responsibilities where we all have resources to give to this question about how life is sustained. And it's a question of sharing those resources that we bring to the situation. And being able to act with trust, to have faith in those values. I talk in this book about an aesthetic of care, that often the actual art is that which emerges. You know, some people might call it socially engaged work or relational practice, but this is the absolute ground of the participatory arts, that often the art is the thing that emerges in the in-betweens, and by heck it's hard to pin down, and we all know that, it's very hard to pin down. But this is an aesthetics of care. So I think it's very interesting because I'm not I am a philanthropist because I give my own resources to my work, and I often give it voluntarily, and I give a lot of time and energy to that. And I think the interesting examples that are emerging at the moment are around associational philanthropy. So, for example, in Detroit, there's a brilliant project called Detroit Soup. You turn up at a venue, you pay $5, you get soup, food, and a vote. And that night, 4 projects pitch, and they're social entrepreneurship, they're arts projects in Detroit. And at the end of the evening, you vote for the one you like the best, and the one that wins gets the money from the take. That's a associational philanthropy, where you're giving a bit of money because you like to be in association with what's happening. You like the value of it. And I think that the characteristic of that kind of philanthropy, I feel that is increasingly becoming the common ground between those with energy and resources, and how we share those values, and how we, you know, establish the purpose of all our work as being in service of life, rather than in supporting systems which are working against that, if that makes sense. And you know, I will end now, but the Happy Museum was one of those projects in this book, and we're working again with People United on that. The Happy Museum is looking at how museums as a sector can look at well-being and sustainability really as 2 sides of the same coin, and how those values of looking after our collections, our museums, ourselves and the planet, it's the same question about stewardship. And I find stewardship in general a very useful touchword in this frame.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy. So now we come to John, who I feel has been given quite a hard task at the end of this, because we've had Regis talking about how, you know, that Paul Hamlin wouldn't fund, you know, artists who are commercially successful, who can sell their own work. We want to start the struggling ones. We talked about saving the planet. So how can we justify spending on the so-called high arts? Aren't they elitists? Opera, you know, opera, art galleries. John?
Well, in 5 minutes I'll try and do that. I'm not sure, actually, that I accept the distinction between the high and the low arts, but I've accepted the challenge, so I'll press on.
Don't accept the distinction. Don't.
No distinctions accepted today.
And I would also much prefer to talk about culture rather than the arts, because it is culture and creativity that defines humanity. I'm sure you all know the Nazi leaders Goebbels and Goering, both of them were credited with saying, when I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun. And in common with some, but not enough politicians, they recognize the power of culture and of opera in particular. Hitler banned what he called the degenerative arts. He used film, and he also used Wagner's operas to serve Nazi ideology. So culture became, and perhaps always has been, a powerful weapon to forge social and political change. So the Second World War, as we know, destroyed Germany's spirit, but not the belief of the German people in the power of culture to express what was important to them. The crucial imperative for Germany after the war was to rebuild their civil society, and so it was that so many cities made it an absolute priority to rebuild their opera houses almost before anything else, because they were emblems of creativity, of culture, and perhaps spiritual renewal. Now, how very different from Britain, you may well be thinking, and I would say, well, yes and no, because of course, as we've heard, Britain is also a nation with a highly developed sense of culture and of creativity. But we do find it really difficult to talk, with the exception of Lucy, we find it very difficult to talk why culture matters. And I think this is a problem, a political problem and a financial problem, because why should you fund what might not be regarded as a priority? Now, opera, I'm responding to this challenge, and I'm mad about opera, but opera has a particular problem. It's so expensive, and the Royal Opera House is seen as a bastion of elitism and privilege, and one can see why, all that, though that is not accurate, as I hope I've demonstrated in my article in this edition. You see, the real problem here is access. Should so much taxpayers' money and philanthropic donations be devoted to pleasing so few? Well, the Royal Opera House and other institutions, such as the Tate, where I worked for some time, these so-called high arts are doing more and more to broaden access. There are the well-known schemes for cheaper seats, but now millions may enjoy their work rather than just 1,000 or 2. And this would be absolutely impossible without both public and increasingly philanthropic funding. Without philanthropy, Tate Modern could not have become the most popular museum of modern and contemporary art in the world. Now, the other reason why I prefer this word culture to the arts is that it's becoming ever more difficult to distinguish between the arts and education. I'm a trustee of 2 charitable organisations that are devoted to both. The Royal College of Music teaches the musicians of the future, and London Music Masters is a small charity that teaches entire classes of primary school children how to play classical music on the violin. I'm a trustee. I must declare an interest. I'm a trustee of London Music Masters. And this charity began 8 years ago as the vision of one philanthropist, Victoria Roby. And our work with very young children in Lambeth and the most challenged parts of Westminster is a perfect example of how the high arts can stimulate creativity, enhance academic performance, and transform lives by opening doors as well as eyes and ears. And here is what some might call an elite art form, empowering the disadvantaged young by enabling them to believe in themselves as well as their fellow pupils and fellow violin players. And what we are doing is extraordinarily powerful because it's leading to both personal and social fulfillment. So, accordingly, a part of me finds it strange that we need to justify funding the arts, whether it's by the state or whether it's by philanthropy. Now, I have a very right-wing friend who's an opera lover and a very generous philanthropist, and he holds some interesting views. He believes that private education should be abolished because it's preserving a social apartheid. He also believes that the national subsidy for opera should be abolished because it's an insult to those who cannot enjoy performances. Now, as a former public schoolboy, I have some sympathy with his views on education, but I do disagree vehemently about funding opera and indeed all the arts. You see, we all know love of opera and music is not confined to London. And if public subsidy were removed, there are not enough people to pay astronomical prices to keep access affordable for the many. And there is insufficient philanthropy to fund orchestras, performers, and all that sustains an art form that inspires millions of people here and all over the world. Here's the challenge. As public funding is reduced, and there is inevitably more and more competition for philanthropic funds, the cultural sector is going to have to learn how to make a much stronger case for the arts and for arts education, without which our young will be impoverished. Now, I believe the case for the arts in Britain has not been well expressed, at least since the advent of the Arts Council, and some have still not yet weaned themselves off a sense of entitlement don't misunderstand me, I believe in public subsidy. But we are now, perhaps a rather crude sense, in a position where culture is in competition with cancer. Moreover, apart from some noble and notable exceptions, standards of fundraising in the arts are, I believe, abysmal. Too many fundraisers don't understand donors. I was recently sent an email by a national arts organisation from someone in the development team who I don't know, and she clearly doesn't know me, because I was invited to attend a cream tea in order to meet the director of a forthcoming new production. Professional curiosity made me read on, and so I learned that this privilege and opportunity would cost me £1,000. Call me old-fashioned, but that is not the way to demonstrate need, inspire philanthropy, or promote the understanding that without culture, life is simply not worth living. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So, quite a challenging group of presentations. Before I start putting some really sort of tricky questions to the audience, which I hope you're going to join in on, Fiona, as guest editor, you know, having done this, do you have any responses to the various things that have been, our different speakers have come up with?
Well, it's very annoying to agree with everyone. I kind of do. I very much agree with Lucy. Actually, last night, Caroline and I went to see a not really very good film, but it was a film about two extraordinary anthropologists, Jane Goodall and Roger Payne, and they are quintessential scientists. They're steeped in science, and mostly we think that scientists think that science will save the world. But actually Roger Payne said to Jane Goodall in conversation, I don't think science will save things anymore. I think it has to be artists, because artists will join the heart and the mind and motivate people to want things to change. So I completely agree with Lucy's point, and I'm delighted that she's published her book and that we can all get some recipes out of the back of it. That sounds great. I also agree with Regis, because he says, don't have that high art, low art thing. And at one point in all of these cards, I'd scribbled something about that. But the point, I think, is well made. It's a false dichotomy. John, of course, comes right at it head on in the way that people usually put this argument, and I think he answers extremely well. What he tells us is that it's far too simplistic, this false dichotomy, that these things are more intrinsically meshed than such simple arguments would allow us to think. My frustration with all of this agreement, my deep frustration is, if we're all so convinced about the power of the arts, and John's point about Hitler and Goebbels is pertinent here, because we called our editorial article, Why Do the Dictators Lock the Poets Up First? If art's so weak, then why do the dictators lock the poets up first? So with all of this kind of passionate belief, with all of this evidence, because we have evidence too, your string players in the East End of London are matched by something I saw on TV the other night, the Geordie Orchestra. Did you see that, Adam? Sorry, Adam's from the northeast like me, refugees we are, which was about a Dudamel type project with young people in a school in Newcastle. It was fantastic, looking at the faces of those children when they had learned to play, not terribly well because it was early days, and be an orchestra and play at the Sage Gateshead, which is one of the biggest concert halls in Europe. I mean, that was transformative. With all of this evidence, why aren't all the schools getting to do that? I'll get a bit cross now. But, you know, we have loads of good projects. Why aren't they all joined up all over the country? Why isn't everybody getting the chance? That's my frustration.
Something very distinct here, says the alien in the room, as a resident alien, is that there is a very complex relationship between political figures being in politics and
Could you just explain why you're the resident?
I'm alien because I'm French.
Yeah, okay,
I don't belong here.
Okay.
But I think what's very interesting is that thinking about Michael Groves, his wife Sarah Vines is a trustee of the Jerwood Foundation, he's passionate about artists. Privately, he's very cultured, he's very interested in culture, he's an art consumer. Publicly, in his role, it's a complete, and he's done his hardest to completely annihilate the arts in school. So there is absolutely no link between his, I would assume, his interest and beliefs and then what he has done. How many arts organizations receive their MPs regularly? How many arts organizations see their European MPs? And how many of these people consume arts? Some do, but very privately. And I think what's very interesting, and one of the things that perhaps is a recipe for success, is to try and make that notion of being involved in art activities with your family, etc., which is normal life, make it more visible for those who don't. I mean, I was a trustee of the Young Vic for years, where Cherie Blair came with her children to the Christmas show. But she was kind of, at the last row, would arrive at the last time. And instead of being visibly going with her children to a sort of alternative pantomime for a thinking family, it was like seen as not done. I think it's really interesting, that complex relationship with accessing culture, and not being seen to do so when you are an elected member of parliament. Very few people are very proud of that. It's a stigma. So that's complicated to then transform it into something positive when it's something that you tried to hide.
So, any views from the floor or questions to our panel? Okay, so several. Let's start with Sue, Andrew, over here. Sue, and you could say who you are just before you speak.
Okay. Sue Daniels. This is fantastic. It's a great discussion. One that 30 years ago, when I started life as a high school music teacher, we were having back then. How do you get more children interested in music and doing an understanding that actually it's for everybody? And culture is the widest thing. I was very upset the other day when I saw the acts of destroying in Iran and Syria. It was just mind-blowing. I think that we have to look at the cultural sector through the prism of both intrinsic economic, social impact, and obviously the politics that lie underneath it, which you alluded to. And until we can look at it as a whole, we're always going to be stuck in these ridiculous sideways arguments, which are going to get nobody anywhere. So I'd like to see a much broader discussion with both politicians and artists and thinkers and funders, all around the table discussing what is really important and why we should do it. Because everybody benefits, society benefits as a whole. And I'm really looking forward to reading the book, because I think it probably nails a lot of these things in one go. But I think we need a much wider discussion. This is a great start, but we really need to make it on.
Thank you. I'm sure that's right. Andrew.
Andrew Barnett, the Political Banking Foundation. There's a lot on which I agree with the panellists, and in particular that I think there is this sort of false dichotomy between social and cultural activities, between private goods and public benefit. But there are two things which I think I want to challenge. The first is that there are people who give money and there are others who take it. And I think that's a desperately old-fashioned view of philanthropy. Personally, I think that philanthropy can be an agent for catalysing things that wouldn't otherwise have happened, bringing people together that wouldn't otherwise meet, providing spaces for people to reimagine the world, which Lucy talked about. It's not about giving away money. But beyond that, there's another false paradigm which I think we could explore, and it is that there are people who produce things and people who consume things, and I think that's also so old-fashioned. And it brings me to the sort of heart of my sort of question, which is, who is the artist? What is the role of the artist? And what is the role of others, people particularly living on the fringes of society? What is their role as potential participants and creators of art that we can enjoy and celebrate in the way that people have earlier today?
Okay, before we take another from the floor, let's answer that one, because it's a really interesting question. And in fact, it did arise for me when Lucy was talking as well about, you know, is all this creation and imagining of our world just the artists, and so in participatory art, Lucy.
I think the combined stories that are brought together here are explaining how we are all artists. If you combine your creativity, which we all have, with intentional change, and the intention there is key. It's a Joseph Beuys idea, it's a Susie Gablick, the reenchantment of art. You know, this is not the first time such a concept, or what is referred to as an expanded concept of art. But it's really key, I feel it's really key at the moment, for us all to identify the artist in us, the scientist as well, but particularly the artist, because the artist gets quite short thrift, really, as being able to play with the deepest of deep emotions, the yearnings that we have, the images that we can conjure with, that will map a different way of being in this world at the moment. So it's a broad sense. Now, clearly, there are people who call themselves artists and dedicate themselves that professionally as a livelihood all their lives. Now, there's a spectrum, and as Rajesh has always said, you know, everything can be dealt with differently. I'll shut up. It's very easy to go on and on.
I think the question of philanthropy as more than money is very right, and it's incredibly obvious. I think it's also very important to realize that if you put in the UK all of the philanthropic sector together, so all trust and foundations spending in 1 year, I think I'm right in saying that it is less than 0.5% of public spending. So if you have a 7% cut in any kind of service, or a 20% cut, or if you have had 17% cut 3 consecutive years, and you throw at whatever that issue is, absolutely all the foundation and trust money, including the Wellcome Foundation with 5 billion assets, you get 0.5%, 0.5%. It's tiny. I mean, it might be vital and very, very important, but in the scheme of spending, it is tiny. So the fact that individuals decide to support very generously the Opera House is their decision, and ultimately that's because they're passionate and they want to see these performances happen. But when philanthropy is presented as a panacea to government cuts, it's a complete fallacy. So obviously philanthropy is important and it's catalytic, and very often it's risk money. It's play money to go and explore something, to try and find a solution that is not part of the core delivery, of the core service. And I think that's terribly, terribly important. It's ring-fencing something that can happen without endangering the whole. But I think Andrew is very right in saying that philanthropy is the power of convening. It's putting people together. It's also thinking across geography and art form. We found here, as indeed Andrew does, people all across the country who tend to perhaps be a bit isolated and can't really think about, you know, not only their peers in faraway places, but let alone people who are working in dance instead of being in visual art, but they're experiencing the same thing. So I think that the power of that convening, that comparing and contrasting is very important. But money matters. and I think that, you know, we are there as a sector also to give money, however small it is. But as you've all realized, I mean, I sit on the board of a small foundation that doesn't make very large grants, but actually we are completely convinced that in the right way, £750 is, you know, enabling extraordinary things to happen. That doesn't mean that we can't make bigger grants as well, and I'm delighted that some people can. But in the words of these particular trustees, what they want is to see something being unlocked, something, you know, being able to happen.
Thank you. Okay, comment here and then over at the back.
You.
My name is Alice Millest. I work at Social Finance and I'm also a trustee for a theatre company called Clean Break. My question or comment really is about evidencing the importance and the impact of the arts. I'm also really concerned that we haven't been that good at articulating why we're important. And I suppose with my day job hat on, there's an evidential impact measurement point, and I think there are some ways in which the arts can achieve really clear, measurable impact, but with my trustee hat on, there are also ways in which it's still tangible, but not, it shouldn't be measured. I suppose one of my questions, just in observation of some of the sort of topics that have come up, is we've talked about how artists can be incredibly powerful in achieving social change or social justice, and I would be interested in how we can articulate that particular impact of the arts.
But I think that the cult of measurement has got very out of hand, especially not just in the arts, but actually all over philanthropy. We like to tell ourselves that we can measure things and provide solid evidence, and then we're really upset when our evidence is rubbished. And Clean Break suffered from this because Clean Break did a piece of evidence, this was some years ago, probably before your time, a very interesting piece of evaluation. Yeah, and it got rubbished by various commentators, perhaps a bit unfairly because it was just too easy to pick it off. Our problem with measurement in some of these things is that we can't always measure in the time frame in which philanthropy thinks about things, the movement taken. The foundation that I now do some work for is only about policy and campaigning. And we know that if we fund a policy change program or a campaign, we may not see the results of it for 10 years. I'll probably have retired by then. Who's going to catch that? And I think the problem with arts projects, quite often of the Clean Break variety, is that they're about changing people's hearts and minds, and the developments of what happens will only be evident in years to come, and other things will have happened in their lives, and we will not be able to make attribution. So I think when we are pushed into doing measurements that we know are false, we should probably resist it, because we'll only get caught out. Lucy.
One of the things I've learned a great deal from working on the Happy Museum is working with Mandy Barnett on something called the story of change, which is an evaluation process. It's a logic model, it's the theory of change. But what I've witnessed in that is an astonishing empowerment of everybody involved, where you literally say, we're going to make a difference, this is our vision, this is how we think we're going to make a difference, this is what we're doing, and this is what is being invested in the work. And then over a process, and it could be a day, it could be 5 years, it could be maybe 10 years, whatever you've got. But that the story of change creates that framework for you to work back from your vision, which you can keep tinkering with as you go. But everybody is feeding in their own story of change. So you get the kind of macro, but you get it fed by all these micros. So that was a revolution for me in terms of measuring what mattered, which was what's the change we're making. And I think it's still in its kind of early days of really becoming an advocacy for actually the process that are afoot. And those are deep personal transformations, those are collective community ones, those are organizational ones, those are societal ones. And you can track all those different changes. But it's much more dispersed, you know, from having one evaluator who arrives with a clipboard. But because it is more dispersed, you're getting at plurality, you're getting at diversity, you're getting at the fact that when everything needs to change, you need everyone. So where do you go for that evaluatory process that has everybody's voices in it? But because they all recognise that they've all got a voice in it, you then get something else kicks in, which is an incredible energy that everybody realises they're making change, whatever their role in a project is. I feel I've learnt quite a lot in that. And I'm wary of this sort of audit culture where you have to show you're going to have an impact before you've even got out of bed in the morning. And so whilst arts evidence and all that, fantastic, because I think there's a genuine, which I feel is partly my job now, having done this process, is to articulate more clearly the power of culture and the arts to reweave the world, and actually why that is needed at the moment, but in very specific practical instances rather than a blah blah grand statement.
what's really interesting in the notion of evidence is that there are things that you will struggle to evidence. And so do you start with a glib statement, we are improving attainment, and then how do you demonstrate it? Because attainment will have in schools, will have lots of factors, including parents and carers, and not just the programs that are going on in school, and how can you possibly measure it? So I think the point about becoming more adept or is becoming more subtle about thinking about what you need to know and for what reason, and is it to run a good organization and make the right decision and make the right choices, to work with the people you're working with in the best possible way for their own aims, for their own achievement, and do they dictate that as they're part of that process, and is it for advocacy? So I think again and learning, which is part. So I think it's making sure that if you have a wrap-up statement, does it matter that you can't back it up? And sometimes it does, and therefore you change the statement, and sometimes it doesn't. But I think that, again, through evaluation like Happy Museum, anecdotes but case studies, well written, are very potent. But then you go to Tom, and when he was setting up People United, and he went to a behavior scientist and said, I'd like you to work with me, and the man laughed and said, you must be mad. And of course then the relationship worked and the measurement tools were put in place, and it worked, but it needed that dialogue to start with. So I think that the point of making more emphasis on it is to make sure that it is commensurate, and you try and think in the way that will not set you up to fail. But I think it's a good lesson when you look at mission statements for organization. They're very, very aspirational and lofty, quite often patronizing, because art is good for you, is done to you, and I think that it's really interesting to think about evidence or evaluation or research. Research is much more interesting word than evaluation or reflective practice, in that way of assessing whether you are delivering what it is that you were set up to do in the first place. I mean, in a program we did called Our Museum, which is about democratizing museums to bring communities in decision-making roles, 12 organizations worked with someone called Bernadette Lynch. Of these 12, and there's a report called Whose Cake Is It Anyway?, 11 had to redo their mission statement because they realized that the mission statement was actually not right. It's extraordinary. Some of them were very established, but had never really thought through. They were doing the stuff, but not really thinking about what it said underneath the name of their organization on their website.
Yes, if you don't mind, I just want to come back in on this question, on the thing about evidence. First, in the editorial, we referred to something published for the RAND Corporation by someone called Kevin McCarthy, all about measurement, which I found quite interesting, because there is a geek in me, as I said before, and that was quite interesting. But the other thing that about evidence that really bothers me is that even when there is good evidence, if you haven't won the heart as well as the mind, all the good evidence in the world doesn't really get you very far. So you've got a double job to do.
Yes, it was interesting that the article that we specifically commissioned for the special feature on evaluation, and when it came in, it was, in fact, it's like, how do you evaluate, your arts programs? And what came in was a sort of self-reflection of terrible doubt. Oh dear, this is something that it makes me feel so uneasy. I just can't get my head around it. And we thought, oh, well, this isn't answering our question, should we? And we said, okay, we'll publish it. It is a sort of existential angst about evaluating arts programs, and that's what we were given. So we just, it was a good piece. We decided to publish it. But it's interesting, the reflection. Before, I've got several questions or comments from the floor. Is there anybody else who wants to comment specifically on evaluation? Is that, yes, because I'd like to keep these ones together first. So, somebody here? And then at the back.
Yeah, my name's Paddy Chatterton. I'm Development Director for London Music Masters that John is the trustee for and very kindly talked about. Possible, not solution, but just I wanted to tell very quickly 2 stories around that deal with this idea of language and evaluation and how one makes the argument for the strength of culture. We had a trust that we wanted to apply to, and I spent the requisite 11 hours agonizingly writing our case for support, trying to make that case as strongly as possible. The trustee of that fund wrote back to say, well, that's all very well, but I'm not entirely convinced. I think we should meet. We offer open days into our schools to see our work in progress. So I said, well, why don't you come to one of these open days? He said, fine. We brought him in. He sat down in a lesson for 20 minutes. He came out and he said, that's all the evidence I'll ever need to see. By watching what we did, he was convinced. And that person would otherwise have needed the evidence of the statistics and all that sort of stuff. Another donor came into one of our schools a few weeks ago. She is a current donor, and she has often seen our children performing. We do quite regular performances at the Royal Festival Hall and at various other places, and she's always said it's very nice, but she wanted to go in. We took her to see a year 2. This is when they are about 5. They're just beginning to pick up a violin and can barely hold the thing. And then we took her to see a year 5, where they'd been playing for about 5 years, and they were learning putting on the Ritz, which they did in about 5 minutes. And she came out and she said, that's what you need to show your funders. Don't show them the performances, they're great, but to see the absolute power of what you do, show the process of the art. And I wonder whether the new language and the evidence that we are trying to find is actually an experience rather than a language. And it's not the polished product, it's the process. And by showing that to funders, we show the evidence, but it's not statistical, it's not language, it's an experiential one. And with social media, with film, we are able to do that. And that the film that you mentioned is just part and parcel of that. You know, you watch that film and you can see the experience of these kids learning, and you are convinced. So I wonder if it's less about language and it's more about experience.
Yeah, sure.
Just very briefly, I would like to say, as we talk about evidence, I believe that the arts and culture need to be acts of faith with a right to fail, and the best philanthropy is a moral commitment. And I can't quite see where measurement comes into any of that.
Thank you. Somebody at the back also to talk about.
Andrew Cooper from the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Trust. I was also going to ask similar questions about learning. A lot of that's been covered, but I was interested to think about learning and impact and measurement. And social justice and social change are difficult to measure. But what about when it comes to individual artists? And are you also interested in the thinking that the artist is doing, and also the enjoyment that people have in seeing a piece of art? Is that part of it, or are we just completely focusing on social justice and social change?
That's a great question.
Having said it, do you want to give a great answer?
What's great about the question is that we started off in this special issue with a title and two concepts to link, arts and social justice. And I think as we went through, we said, there is no link, they just are. Mm-hmm. They just are together. And I think, in a sense, that's my answer to your question. All artists, whatever type they are disruptive and rebellious and questioning and interesting, and therefore they are involved in social comment, social ideas, social thinking, social stimulation. And anything that makes people think and makes people feel more alive and part of the world leads them on the path to social justice. That would be my view. I don't think politicians would be convinced, except they are, because they always lock the poets up first.
Anybody else want to come in on sort of the measurement? John threw out something very provocative. He said funding arts is an act of faith. You can't see where measurement comes in. And it was interesting that one of our articles we ended up with, the title was An Act of Faith. That was just coming from what everybody said. Was that, Charles, I haven't forgotten you at the back, but were you coming in on this question? Yes, please.
Hello, my name's Tom Andrews from People United. I think it is important to measure, mainly around reflection side of things. I don't do it because of the funders, don't because of the publicity to come out of it, although that's nice as well, and we have received some funding because of but we do it because we care about the impact of our work and the difference we want to make. So we're interested in what could be seen as quite an intangible area of work, which is the role of arts in growing kindness, altruism and social change. What are the conditions that enable us to come together? That looks at empathy and social inclusion. But when we started off, I wanted to be sure, we've set up this organisation 10 years ago. Are we really making a difference in the world? I want to understand that. I want to understand that from case studies and qualitative work. But that's why we work with the University of Kent and with social psychologists to measure longitudinally over 2 or 3 years whether people see people that are different from themselves in a different way, whether they're more likely to help one another, whether they interact with their neighbours. And none of this is perfect. And we learn, and I think research is important, but I think the most important thing is we want to learn. We're willing to make mistakes, but we want to make sure our work benefits as people as much as we can. And so if the research and evaluation tests us and sometimes isn't quite right, that's fine. But the key is, how does it improve our work so we benefit people? And as Lucy and Regis said, it's vital that there is a clarity of aims, because you can't do evaluation or research unless you know what you're about. That was my point. And long term was your point as well, which was very good. And this is very hard. You find clues and you can pick up a message. But I think it's very hard if you have to apply in a month's time, do your project and then do it's a long term and it's a story. And so I think the long term aspects are really important to put that in the mix as well.
I'd like to go back on enjoyment, because I think that's a really interesting point, which is, you know, it's fine to be earnest and worthy, but at the end of the day, is it good or is it good fun? One of the major issues in participatory work is the issue of quality and quality standards, and it's a very thorny issue. When you look at the endless models from national occupational standards to which think about quality of participatory interventions where artists are part of or leading work, systematically enjoyment is one of the criteria. So it's reaction from participants. So when you think about a quality standard, enjoyment is in every single one of them. Partly because it's the thing you pick up when you walk in the room, if you are actually witnessing the work taking place. It's the depth of engagement of the people, you know, being involved. It's how applied they are, etc. And what's interesting is that it's also what spontaneously you would pick up as a person if you walked into a space. You get a sense of what the vibe is about. But I think enjoyment, you're quite right. And I don't think that thinking about it as one of the signs of quality devalues the fact that it exists for itself. And it, you know, it's about people doing work, whether they're professional or not professional, and being in the moment and enjoying it. And the same would apply working in a market garden, or, you know, working together on an allotment, or, you know, it's that sense in the moment. So I think you absolutely, it is part of what being thought about, but by being thought about, it doesn't make it instrumental, or, you know, it's just, it's an indicator. But as an indicator, I think you're completely right in mentioning it. It's really, really, really important. Otherwise, it's not about bettering oneself. That's such the wrong approach, I think.
Thanks, I'm Charles Keedon. Just wanted to return to what Regis and Andrew were saying about the great potential of philanthropy to contribute to the arts, and identified issues about its catalytic, convening role, the kind of marginal income that can be used for really creative ways to foster dissent. And I think that's all true, but I just want to place it on the other side, and that's the other aspects of the potential of philanthropy, and that's, if you like, particularly in the arts and as well as other sectors, this vehicle for an exercise in power. particularly in the naming of buildings, the associations, the social and political power that's often associated with arts institutions, particularly some of the more notable ones. And I just wonder whether there's a tension between those two elements, the potential, the social justice and democratic potential that philanthropy can, at its best, unlock, but at the same time there's potential philanthropy to the arts to be a vehicle for some of the most powerful elites in society to find recognition from each other and their peers. And is that the price worth paying? Thank you.
Historically, support of the arts as arts, not culture. If you go back to Italy in the 15th century or 14th century, historically, patronage of the arts, being a patron of the arts, meant having a purchasing power, and whether you believed in the artist or you believed in the beauty of what the artists were making in order to adorn your walls or your garden or your building, etc. I think that's that tension has always existed. But I go back to that very fundamental issue, which is philanthropy comes from many different routes, and it goes through money, which is that in order to be philanthropically minded, at some point you've accumulated an element of money, and you might give £5 to a cause that you believe in because that's within your means, and you make that act. But even in that act, you make a choice whether you buy your poppy and you wear it or not. So it's not neutral, and that's where the sector is made up of such different forces motivated by very, very different things. And so it might be, so is it dangerous? I don't know, but I really can't, that's why the sector in itself is not a sector, it's a collection of individual bodies motivated by very, very different things. And yes, when Jerwood gave money all these years ago, the Royal Court was failing in their capital appeal. They were short of 3 million. And Alan Grieve, as the chairman of the Jerwood Foundation, very cleverly said, I'll give you the last 3 million and you'll name the theatre for the Jerwood Foundation. They said yes, and then it was all over the press saying the Royal Court is selling out. Well, it was a foundation, it was not, it's someone who was dead, but it was about branding. The Jerwood Foundation has in its capital what we spend in a year. But they are, if you do a market survey within the arts community, they rate very, very high on recognition, and they do jolly good work. The reason they rate high in recognition is that they branded themselves very, very heavily. And that was a very conscious decision from a grant maker. And they wanted their name to become visible based on not that much money.
Could I just add something here? It depends what we mean by dangerous. First things first, philanthropy has always been and will always be about personal choice. We're thinking here about individuals, of course, rather than foundations, but that was the point. What would be dangerous if the power that comes with money and being able to exercise that power through philanthropy started to subvert or pervert arts and culture. And I don't believe that happens in this country. You could argue that in the US, which is, to my mind, a plutocracy almost rather than a democracy, the power of donors, you look at an arts board of major institutions, and they're primarily made up of people who give the money. And I'm as sure as I can be that there is an influence on artists and on programming. In this country, through plural funding, philanthropists do not, by and large, have that power. And the most important thing of all is that enables us to maintain the independence of the artist. So I think you're raising a very valuable point, and we need to keep reminding ourselves that philanthropy in our country is not dangerous and exerting power in an antisocial way. So I don't want to sound complacent, but I think we probably got it right.
I hope this point is connected. I think something very, very interesting is happening at the moment, which is with this kind of general waking up to the context that I've mapped at the beginning, is that a lot of questions are being asked, and I think the interesting question for philanthropists at the moment is about sort of values and actions. And one of the questions that's being asked at the moment, and I think it's fantastic when philanthropists take the view of risk and backing uncertainty and faith and trust and recognising that it's their experimentation hand in hand with other experimentation that's going on, will produce extraordinary things, particularly at a time when political will and the public's imagination are kind of slower. You know, we need the pioneers, we need the experimenters. We just think about the COP talks in Paris at the end of this year. You know, we've got a long way to go to cover the ground, to catch up with the public imagination and to catch up with political will. So it's these absolutely kind of brilliant sort of pioneering activities that are very, very creative and produce remarkable results. But there's a question here about value action, which I think is also about where is the money coming from? And a lot of questions going on now about, your investments, what are your investments tied to? So we've talked a lot about the sort of demand on funders, but people are going around the back now and beginning to question, you know, the ethical nature of where that money is coming from. We've got a bit here called Know Your Place on the Oil Road and How to Get Off It, about closing that value action gap. And we've seen in terms of branding, fantastic, but it brings with it certain perils. You know, and we've recently seen the Wellcome Trust being questioned for their well-being policies, but possibly at odds with their sustainability practices. We've got the Rockefeller Foundation, you know, made their money from fossil fuels, now declaring that they're going to disinvest. It's a very interesting time to be around, to be both helping to ask the questions and also helping to find the answers.
I think asking the question is really important because, you know, Mark Flick very famously, his money was refused in order to create a business school, but the Said Business School is up and running. And, you know, Wafiq Said is an arms dealer. So up to a point, I mean, it's just sort of, and I think that these important issues of, but this is achieving something that is without any doubt for the greater good in a much longer time frame than one's lifetime. But I think you're right in asking the question. I think the great difference with public funding is that public funding comes with a very high accountability. And sometimes it makes it indeed, it's prisoner of its own accountability. Ultimately, trust and foundation are accountable to their deeds, to what it is that they were set up with. And it's much, much more personal. So even though we employ well over 30 staff, applying to us, even at arm's length, is rather more personal, and the decision-making and the assessment will be more personal than going through HLF, for example, because that's kind of how we set up. So it's also, where is the accountability and the accountability to whom and to what? But I think you know, you're right. There is that, it's not grey. I think it's, there's no clear lines, or the lines are slightly more diffuse.
Can I just say, I think that's the key question. Accountable to whom and to what? That, to me, absolutely nails it, you know. And it is within our lifetime. Really sorry to say this, Regis.
Yeah.
But I think you're going to live for another 20 or 30 years, and that's the time frame. It's us. It's us. It's happening on our watch, you know. We were born into it, and we will die in it. It's on our watch. It's down to us.
Okay. Any other question? Any? Yes?
Sorry, I just wanted to come back to it because my concern really around kind of articulating ourselves is because the public sector is such a huge part of the funding, and we've seen the cuts that have come through year after year after year. And if we turn up to HM Treasury and say funding the arts is about faith, they just don't buy it.
No, of course.
And so what my fear is we can all sit here and we all understand it, and it's great and it's obvious, but we have to work out how we can explain it to HM Treasury. Otherwise, the main source of funding is just going to erode and erode and erode.
Can I was at something very interesting the other day at the House of Commons. The Well-Being Economics All-Party Parliamentary Group, astonishing work on really articulating an alternative to GDP, which is our current measurement of progress in this country. It's useful, but actually in many ways it's disastrous. And what was very interesting about that Wellbeing Economics group is that they had absolutely named arts and culture as absolutely a plank of progress in terms of well-being economics. In other words, an economic model which prospers our well-being and across the board. But also that it was the participatory arts above all that should be invested in. And I think that if you're a creative practitioner, you absolutely have a statutory right to public funding. I mean, I know that philanthropy is slightly to one side, but I think what has yet to happen is a really clear articulation of the responsibilities that go with that right. So we have a right, but if we could get a chance to really name the responsibilities and that accountability that we feel in the way that I've described, I feel the dots haven't quite been joined, you know, because we have a power system and a very dominant narrative which kind of endlessly puts us in a role of sort of supplicant. And actually, hold on a minute, you know, we're talking about something which is about everything combining in our practice, and we feel accountable to things. And I agree, I think there's work still to be done, but there's a hell of a lot of there's a revolution happening. I mean, it's absolutely clear. It's bottom-up, it's people-led, it's value-led, and it's about accountability. And it's saying, oh, stop, this dominant narrative is not working for us. We need other stories to live by. And it's those other stories that are piling in, and they're changing everything. They're changing everything. But I agree, it's not quite there. Maybe in a year's time it will be. Maybe next week it will be. Let's work on it together.
That's optimistic. Before we end, you know, one of my, looking back at the special features one does when you sort of put it to bed and you sort of don't even think as you're going along, one of my only regrets was that we hadn't somehow, I don't know if some of them were meant to be contrarian voices and they turned out not to be, but we didn't include anybody who was want to argue really we shouldn't be funding the arts. This is a question our philanthropists shouldn't be funding the arts. It is a competition between culture and cancer, or culture and hunger, and you know, and there is a discussion to be had, and maybe there is an argument to be made on the other side. Now, I think it would be a very brave person in this group, given all the conversation we've had, who said, "Yeah, I really do think this is an issue." Is there anybody who would like to? Can we have a?
I'm Iraima Paredes, and I work for Global Giving. I don't work in the arts sector at all. I am not knowledgeable about the arts sector at all. But coming from a third world country, I find it a very high sphere conversation that we're having today. I am a fundraiser, and I just find it it's a bit difficult. I come from Venezuela, and we have an incredible arts program with regards to music. And I think what they've done well, among many bad things that they've done, is that they have managed to really show how you can transform people from very, very poor backgrounds, and how arts have really changed the lives of those people, because these programs have been going on for 40, 50 years. And it has become part of the communities. Where I come from, neighbors are driving the kids to music lessons, and they start training. It's from the Sistema. They train at 6 in the morning. And where I come from, the son of the gardener goes to there in my little community, and the neighbors take a rota to take him to play at 6 in the morning before he goes to school. And I think that's something that's lacking. I think here, even though we have a good economic that we could pay to go to the opera, but I think it's just not accessible for everyone. And I think many things, it seems that it's the arts, it's just not accessible still. Of course, you have the Tate and you have amazing museums that you can go to for free, but in general, many things are just not accessible and are not linking with the normal population. And I think that's something that I would find it difficult as a fundraiser to fundraise for the arts, because I'm not convinced it is a priority when you see what's happening everywhere around the world. And I just find that hard. How do you deal with that? How do you think you are connecting with someone in a small village anywhere in England, and how do you think that is transforming lives? And I think that's just going a bit down to a more simple.
But I think it's differently, but when you think about the number of arts organizations, most of the arts organizations are community arts.
So I think that the ones you think about, it's a bit like...
But it's the one I'm access
yeah,
to, the one
well,
I
but
hear
I think
about.
it's because you live here, but actually if you think about your London boroughs, there are a lot of arts organizations that are only focused on a particular type of provision in a particular kind of borough that you wouldn't see because they're below the waterline. And I think that the sector suffers exactly like the NHS. It might be a system that is not working, but globally it works. But what you read about is the dreadful things where people died because they waited. You see when the system doesn't work, like flying. You read about the crash, but how many thousands of flights take off and land? And I think with the arts, there is a polarization on the very large, very big and very shiny ones, and partly because they take quite a lot of money. But I really think that the reality of the infrastructure, I mean, over the last 10 years, we spend between 20 and 24% of our money in London. The rest is outside of the country. So actually, you know, the reality when you go to Sunderland, as I was last week, is that the arts in Sunderland are layered. I mean, there is the Glass Centre, which is a building and is there, but there are lots of other things going on. So I think it's very easy to associate it with the big building. A lot of the arts don't have a building. You know, a lot of what's going on in people's lives, whether it's choir or don't even have a door. You don't see it.
Can I just use the word which I don't think we've heard yet today, class, because this is another negative. Unless somebody can prove to me to the contrary, I suspect most people who enjoy the arts are middle class people. I think this is something that was a problem to the, if you can disprove that, I'd be thrilled, Régis, because I want to be wrong. But I do have a worry that this is a middle class thing.
I think I'd really like to jump up and down.
Well, do.
Yeah.
Go on, please.
But your microphone. You
Serve
can't
the
jump.
microphone, but jump up and down, please.
I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, you are really wrong.
Good.
Because
Good.
I think that the key thing for every single one of us to ask ourselves at the moment is if we are committed to a sustainable future and a world in which life is cherished and sustained, the work of artists who work collaboratively and predominantly in the participatory arts are opening spaces up in which the breadth and depth of engagement is such, and it is the participatory nature of that work which is astonishing. And whether it's happening in prisons or in hospitals or in school playgrounds or on high streets or in allotments or on bandstands or up mountains or on rivers, that's the work that is at a very deep level really is truly changing things. And I feel that that's the question we all have to ask ourselves, artists and creative practitioners as well, is that a different art in a way needs to be defined and celebrated here. That's the bit of the plot of Earth I'm sitting on anyway.
And I think it depends when you call arts. If you look at the attenders in one night at the Grand Opera House in Leeds, it will be a particular kind of work. But actually they spend all their day working outside of the Grand and doing quite a lot of other things. And that is core work, it's core provision. So I would challenge that comment, which is again, it's a bit what are you calling by arts and culture? You know, what are your points of reference? What are you looking up to? And yes, you know, the Opera House or in Leeds, it's a particular type, and the people who will be inside that building at a particular moment will be of a particular kind. But that's a tiny number compared to whoever is engaging in cultural activity on any given day, even in these organizations, even with the Opera House.
I made the point, of course, to be provocative,
Yeah,
and what I think is that where we are failing in terms of making the case and communication, which is something I said in my short address, is that the politicians don't know that, or they're
Or don't want to
pretending,
know.
or they don't
to
want to know, or they're pretending. So that's part of the challenge, isn't it?
Comment here, please.
Hi, I'm Emily Horn. I'm from the National Theatre. So I felt as a national organisation should say I completely agree with everything you're saying about the importance of grassroots organisations and the art that's happening around the country is vital. One of the challenges we face as a national organisation is we are a big building based in London, and the majority of our audience, about 60%, are from London boroughs. But there is work that we're very keen to take out sort of beyond. We very much take our role as a national theatre seriously. And for example, there's a project we're launching this year that's, so we have NT Live, which has been a great step forward in terms of taking our work out to cinemas around the country and around the world, to people that may not be able to come to the National. But I think, as John was saying, I think it does come down to class. I think there are certain families that might take their theatre, that might take their children to the cinema to see a National Theatre Live production. They might be the kind of families that get on a train and come down to the National anyway. So it's about kind of going that step further. And so, for example, we are now launching something called National Theatre on Demand that's going to take those NT Live performances into every secondary school in the country for free, so that, and with accompanying learning resources for teachers, so that it's implanting that in the classroom and then hopefully bridging that gap between seeing it in the classroom and then perhaps going independently. However, that's not the kind of message that gets out there. I agree. I mean, I think MPs use arts when it's convenient. So, for example, Warhorse went on the Prime Minister's trade delegation to China recently and made a huge impact and was a fantastic photo opportunity and example of how culture is such a fantastic export for the UK. But that's our kind of blockbuster. It doesn't reach people around the country. And I think that these sort of deeper sort of engagement projects do need to be communicated better by our MPs as well as the organisations that deliver them.
Okay, we're just about coming to a close. So before I ask our panellists for just a final word each, is there anybody else from the audience who've got any comment they'd like to make, to add? If not, I'm going to start with Fiona. Do you want to start just a closing comment?
Okay, my closing comment is that this has been a really interesting debate. And like all these things, I feel we've almost only got to the interesting, tricky bits at this stage, which is not to say anything bad about the previous contributions. But whereas we started with kind of mutuality and comfort, now we've got into some interesting disagreements. And thank you very much for being the brave person who spoke up. You actually answered your own question because you told us about how the people in the village get up early and go on a rota to take this child to school, to music school. They obviously believe the same thing that I believe, and therefore they probably also believe that investment in the arts is not a waste of time because they're putting their own philanthropic getting up early and taking the child off to music class into that project. So I feel that the argument about valuing the arts is one, but I think that the interesting discussions and tensions, I could happily talk to each of you for an hour, and I'm not going to be allowed to, which is very frustrating.
Sorry.
Right.
John.
Thank you. I would just like to focus, amongst all the very interesting things that have been said, on the need for us to make a stronger case for the role that art and culture plays in our lives and contributes to our society, because we're going to always need money. We're going to have to continue to make the case for public money. We can't do without it, and we know there's going to be less of it. And although we know that philanthropy in all its various forms is only contributing a little bit, you see, I'm one of those people who find it very difficult to say, well, of course, we're a very generous country. Actually, I'm not sure that we are, and I think we could be a lot more generous than we are, and we need to be a lot more generous, but that's not going to happen unless we get the case right.
Thank you. Régis.
I'm worried about the fact that the arts and indeed the social services have become so lean they're emaciated because of subsequent successive cuts over the last few years. And I think we've not seen the end of it, and I think it's about to get significantly worse, particularly at local authority level. When we look at, we have a portfolio of about 160 grants in the education sector and about 130 in the art sector. Very, very few organizations have closed down over the last 5 or 6 years. Very few, like, you know, a handful. And I keep thinking that it's about to hit us, and it kind of doesn't exactly hit, but it will come. And I worry about that moment. And we know about the collapse, about social services, youth services, you know, core provision across the country. I think the arts have actually been remarkably protected, all things being equal. Education is in a pretty dire state in England, absolutely not the case in Wales and from an arts point of view and in Scotland. And I just really dread the next few years because there will be less money. And the imperative of thinking differently, of reinventing model, of not taking growth as bigger is better, will be important. But, you know, there are hardly any reserves left, and the infrastructure, the public infrastructure that used to exist is gone. So on what are you building these new collaborations, these new partnerships? They need to exist on their own. And so I think we need to read this and go straight to the recipe section.
Lucy.
I'm actually quite looking forward to the next few years. I think we've been educated and cultured to think about scarcity a lot, to kind of narrow our feeling that everything's kind of disappearing and scarce resources make us a bit panicky. And I think that's quite deliberate. I think there's a bit of political kind of ideology behind that. And so I'd like to just flip that over and think, rather than scarcity, I would like to think really about the great abundance that is in us all for our own creative energies. And I really do predict that there will be an extraordinary reinvention of the arts, absolutely at the centre of our daily life. And a lot of that will be around relocalization, which we haven't really touched on, but the idea that our communities, however we understand that, our communities will be the core driver of that reconnection and that sense of creativity and energy which we all share. And I don't even think we've seen the beginning of that. And that's why I am very, very excited, notwithstanding the challenges, but I don't think we've even really seen what harnessing that collective, shared, creative energy looks like, and it will redefine everything.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to end on that positive note when we easily could not have done. So thank you so much. Glad us all to thank our 4 great panellists. And thanks to all of you for coming.